In my first year, when I read research articles and things like that, I didn't understand much of it. Now, I'm getting there. I'm doing better. And now I'm going to try and give a summary of one of our recent research papers. Taking the human brain, in one particular part, there is an area called the auditory cortex. And the auditory cortex is there to organise and understand sounds. Certainly so for hearing people. And in our recent paper, the surprising findings are that for deaf people, the auditory cortex is also used for working memory, which is really surprising. Working memory is for cognitive processing, for changing, storing and updating information. That's what the working memory is for. Okay, so that's really interesting. It's interesting because that means that the brain and all its different parts can change and adapt. How parts of it function can change. Auditory input is sensory information. But for deaf people, they're using that part of the brain for higher level cognitive functions. Well, that's interesting. That means that the brain has this incredible ability to adapt. Now, we've known for some time that the brain makes adaptations, but to change to this extent is significant. So I'm going to explain a bit more about our research project, about what we found, and to tell you how this is relevant and to what. So, we study the deaf brain. And one of the reasons that we are interested in looking at the deaf brain is to allow us to evidence and then inform people and guide them in different ways to have improved health outcomes and improved educational outcomes for deaf people. Also to promote a better understanding of deaf people. By exploring the deaf brain, we're able to learn more amazing things about how the brain typically works for everybody. How does the brain function? What is its potential? Why? Because the brain is an organ and we use it to take information from the world, sensory information, visual, auditory, tactile, through our eyes, ears, through touch, in all these different ways. To give an example, if you look at a picture, that information comes in through your eyes, it's passed to the brain, where it's processed in the visual cortex. In the hearing population, the brain works out what sounds mean. And that happens in the auditory cortex. Okay, so what happens in the auditory cortex in the deaf population? Is it the same or is it different? Is it part of the brain that's just never used? Or is it used for something else? If it's used for something else, what is its function? So these were the questions that we wanted to explore, taking the deaf brain to help us understand and answer the questions. Now, to talk about the auditory cortex and the deaf brain. Previous research from my group and other researchers looked at the auditory cortex in deaf people and what it was used for. It was found to adapt for visual input and touch, which we call somatosensory. So questions were asked about how this happens. What happens when there's a change in the brain? When an area is typically used for auditory input, how does it change for visual and tactile information in the deaf population? One theory is that there is actually no change, which is a bit strange. But I will give an explanation through example, and I hope that will make things clearer. So we know that there are specific parts of the brain for specific functions, for specific processes across all the different areas of the brain. Sensory input is then distributed to different parts of the brain. So for some parts of the brain, they may be for understanding where sounds are coming from and knowing the source of the things you hear. Another part is for knowing how fast that sound has travelled to reach you, and therefore its speed of movement. Previous studies have found that in deaf people, parts of the brain that are typically used for processing movement and source, they adapt and are used for visual motion processing to identify the direction of movement of visual information and its speed of motion, as well as direction. So the brain's busy processing those things. This means that for the auditory cortex, as one part of the brain, it still has the same function, processing movement and location. But the difference is in the type of sensory input, not being auditory, but visual. So that happens in the deaf population. And in a nutshell, the evidence is that brain function remains the same in hearing and deaf people. Well, how? I'll try and explain that using an analogy. If you think about a food processor, imagine, let's say, you put in a carrot, add a tomato. It's going to slice up the tomato and it's going to slice up the carrot just the same. That's what a food processor does. It doesn't really care what food goes in. It's going to slice it. It's its job to slice things. Well, that's the same when we think about the brain and the neurons in the brain. They don't really care what information it is that they're dealing with, whether it's visual or auditory. It's just information, electrical signals to be processed. So the neurons still identify that there is movement, whether that's visual or auditory. It doesn't matter to them. Can the brain change function? Well, it preserves its functions, but that's only one part of the story. There are interesting things about humans such as understanding the deaf brain and its organisation of processes and high-level functions, such as working memory, like I mentioned earlier. How does it do that? Well, we designed an experiment using a working memory task and also a colour comparison task. What we were interested to see was the activation in the auditory cortex. In that part of the brain, the activation that we saw when someone was doing a working memory task in the deaf population, where there was no visible activation in the hearing population with the same test. Very different results between those two groups. And there's more than that. In the deaf brain, where we see that working memory activation, we didn't see any activation for the colour task. These results are quite strange. Do they mean there's preservation of function, regardless of whether it's visual or auditory stimuli, like I said before? Some of the functions in the auditory cortex carry on as normal, but there is sometimes a change in the role to higher level cognitive processing. But just in deaf people. So what might that mean? Again, I'm going to use my analogy of a food processor. So the functional change means that with the food that goes in the processor, it's still sliced. The tomatoes that go in all get sliced. But if we put in a carrot, it isn't sliced. Something different happens. The carrot goes in and it comes out as soup. How that happens might be something to do with a different blade being used, or a whole new processor, like a different device. We don't know. It's the same thing with the brain. This one area of the brain, it changes from its auditory processing function that hearing people use, and for deaf people, it becomes part of working memory. Something's changed. Maybe this is to do with the neurons, and they're behaving differently. Or there are different neurons. Something is different. These results are surprising and interesting, but just a first step. We still need more studies, more experiments, so that we can make sure that we're sure, is there a change in function? So now we're looking into this, doing further in-depth studies, and we're trying to understand, in the auditory cortex, are we seeing working memory functions, high-level cognitive processing, functional preservation, as well as functional change? Do we see them both simultaneously? Can that happen? Is this cross-modal plasticity? What do we see that's different and the same?